McMorris. Kristina McMorris is the best-selling author published by Kensington Books, Avon HarperCollins UK, and Berkeley Penguin. Her works of fiction have garnered more than 20 national literary awards, as well as nominations for prestigious Rita Award. Inspired by true personal and historical accounts, her novels include Letters from Home, Bridge of Scarlet Leaves, and most recently, The Pieces We Keep. Prior to her writing career, she worked as a host on weekly TV shows since the age 9, including an Emmy Award-winning program, and she owned a wedding and event planning company, thereby subjecting her to enough YMCAs and chicken dances to last a lifetime. Kristina has been named one of Portland's 40 under 40 by the Business Journal and currently lives in Oregon with her husband and 2 young sons.
I said it to my kids, and they're like, "Who?" Oh, never mind. I never feel so dated suddenly. Okay. Thank you so much for the intro and having me this evening. I'll start out by saying that among my friends, I'm considered an accidental author. So I had not planned on writing or making that my career, even just a short amount of time ago. When I was a kid, I did not dream of being published, and I did not scribble in journals all the time, which I'm so envious. I wish I had. I would have a lot less catching up to do at this point. I wanted to be a belly dancer, and I'm thankful that didn't work out, actually. Yeah. So tonight, I thought instead of reading an excerpt, I feel like even though I wasn't actively writing for my whole life, I have always been a storyteller. And I was a big movie buff, and didn't have all these useless information. Part of my brain stores quotes from every movie possible. So phone a friend, call me if it's a movie question. So tonight I thought I would just talk a little bit about, actually share stories with you, which tonight has been full of, and I love that, about the true stories that inspired my books, and also about the strange and unique journey that I took to get here. Get back to here. So I'll start with my new shiny toy, which I like to pet at night. The Pieces We Keep is my latest novel. It just came out 2 months ago, so I'm still a little tired from crazy promotion, as every author in here understands firsthand. The story essentially is about a 7-year-old boy who suddenly suffers from violent recurring night terrors about dying in a plane crash during World War II. And that was inspired by a national news segment you might have seen a few years ago. From there in the story, his behavior worsens to the point that his mother, who doesn't believe in any of this, has to put her skepticism aside in order to help save her son. And in doing so, she ends up unraveling a mystery that traces back to a true account of Nazi saboteurs who were dropped off by U-boat on the east coast of America in 1942. Sound all that in one breath. Aside from me being fascinated by learning that account, and it was a declassified account that a friend shared with me about Nazi spies who were in America. FDR was involved. There were deceptive dealings by J. Edgar Hoover. Imagine that. I was so surprised about that. So obviously that one sparked interest for me. But the other part of it that is such on a much more personal note is that I have 2 young boys who are now 7 and 10, and absolute joy in my life. Both of them. 10 going on 40 is what we call him. He wanted for Christmas, side note, the only thing he wanted for Christmas was a jumbo panda from Santa. Thankfully, Santa got that down the chimney, and he wanted the clapper. Yes, that clapper. Yes, he thinks that's the coolest thing ever, so we say he's 10 going on 80 now. So he is, actually this segues really well, he is an old soul. He always has been. We've seen it in his eyes since he was born. Everybody's always said that about him. And so for me, on a personal note, he used to also suffer from night terrors as a toddler. And at times he would even talk about a grandmother who didn't exist. Now, was that creative ramblings of a youngster? Absolutely could be. But as a writer, which apparently I am now, I thought, what if, when I heard about that news segment, I thought, what would I do in that mother's situation if my son suddenly started to spout historical, verifiable, obscure facts that he couldn't possibly know at his age? What would I do with that information? And that question ended up laying the foundation for The Pieces We Keep. And to back up a bit on how I ended up coming even to that point, it was just a handful of years ago that I, like I said, was not a creative writer, and I'm ashamed to say I was not even a reader. I would read a book a year. I thought that was pretty good. And those were page turners, you know. So I was all about efficiency. Like I said in my intro, I was an event planner and a TV host at the time. So for me, it was all about efficiency. So if I could read a book in 10 hours, but watch a movie in 2, that sounded pretty good. Again, not proud of that, really. But so with this in mind, I went up to visit my grandmother up in Washington. She lives on the Hood Canal at Lake Cushman. And I was visiting her for the weekend because I was compiling a cookbook, which a lot of you I'm sure have done or received in the past from your family, full of recipes that she had collected and created over decades, and I was going to put it together at Kinko's as a Christmas present for all of the grandkids. Almost as an afterthought, I decided to include a biographical section about her life, thinking this would be kind of fun to pass along to all the grandchildren. Well, I sat down and started interviewing her that afternoon. And of course, what she started sharing with me were all these stories I had never heard before. So I knew a little bit. I knew she had been an Iowa farm girl who had grown up in the morning where she would milk the cows and get the eggs from the chicken and walk 8 miles to school uphill both ways in a snowstorm, naked. Maybe not naked. And but what I did not know, and that she shared with me that day, was that she and my late grandfather, whom I was very close to, he passed away about 20 years ago, that they had only dated twice during World War II. They'd exchanged letters the entire time. They fell in love and were married for 50 years until he passed away. She then asked me if I'd like to see those letters because she kept every one of them. I mean, even now I get chills thinking about that because it seemed like a trick question. Of course I want to see those letters. Nobody in the family knew she'd kept them. And when I asked her, Grandma, why didn't you share this with anyone in the family? She said, well, nobody asked. Which, was right in line with that generation, of course, the humbleness of it, and thinking that they're nothing special, which to me makes them so special. So she pulled those letters out, and they were wrinkled and yellowed and beautiful, and they were a 19-year-old sailor pouring out his heart because he didn't know he'd be coming home tomorrow. And when I left her house, I was so moved by it. Little did I know that my whole life would change because of that day. And when I got to the car, I remember thinking, wow, this would make a really good movie. I feel like The Notebook means Saving Private Ryan. Wouldn't it be cool if the soldier fell in love, but it was a different girl right back? It'd be Cyrano de Bergerac, set during World War II. That's pretty cool. I watched that movie. Nicholas Sparks. Okay. So, but of course I didn't have, the skills to write a script or a craft service table or a crew on hand. So I just set that idea aside, and we fast forward a few years, and I was pregnant with my second child. I was clearly high on hormones, and I thought I could create life, so a book seemed pretty easy. I wish I was joking. So I called my mother and said, I'm kind of thinking of writing this book, because everybody on your first novel should definitely write World War II, because nobody cares if you get the facts wrong about that. And my mother thankfully had a lot of faith in her daughters and said, honey, I think you should. Okay, she knew I wasn't even a reader, but I don't know, she thought that was fun. So my mother thought it was a brilliant book, of course, and if your mother thinks it's brilliant, then it has to be. And thankfully, I went through many a revision and really gained a huge admiration for writers and also for the whole greats generation. I mean, it's so deservedly, and of course, we're losing them way too fast. So in a way, I feel like my books have become sort of a love letter, not only to my grandparents, but to that generation. So, and that includes the heroes that went overseas, the heroes that stayed home, including the women. So anyway, I'm pretty proud of that. Let's see, where was I? I kind of went off track there for a second. So as far as, that's my mother telling me I'm brilliant. Okay, so I ended up ultimately selling Letters from Home, is what it became, and I sold it in a 2-book contract, which is very exciting, and most authors know you are rejoicing because it means you're employed for just a little bit longer. In my case, unfortunately, I never planned to write 1 book, let alone 2. So for me, I thought, oh no, I have no ideas. I have no idea what I'm going to write about. Thankfully, I remembered that an old family friend had once shared with me that he had served for America while his brother served for Japan. And I thought, wow, and I've always been fascinated by that story because it reminded me a lot of The North and the South, the miniseries that I grew up with, Patrick Swayze getting your fourth on a horse. You all remember that too, I know you do. It was Ori Vane, and I had all 12 VHS tapes, so you had to rewind every one of them to watch. And I remember that, and I thought, it reminded me a lot of the Civil War and the fact that you had loved ones who were overnight told you are now enemies because of some arbitrary line that somebody else has drawn. And I thought, wow, this would make it actually a pretty book, not movie this time. And so I sat down to write a story about brothers. And I started researching, and I usually research 4 or 5 months before I start writing my books. And I came to find out, I came across a very obscure mention of roughly 200 non-Japanese spouses who lived in the internment camps voluntarily. Now, it never occurred to me that that would happen, but it's one of those obvious ones of course they would. What if they had a child? It wouldn't be very common, but of course that would happen. I'm half Japanese myself. My father is an immigrant from Kyoto, so for me, it really struck a chord, and I realized that my own children, of course, would be interned. It only took 1/16 Japanese blood to be interned at the time, which is incredible. I think they're all probably 1/16 Japanese. You just don't know it. And so I thought, wow, that's a perspective that I could share that would be unique to me, and that I knew what it was like to grow up in both of those cultures, not really know where I fit in, and really wanting to be that blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl, and having a friend, thank goodness, at one point in high school tell me, she's a beautiful Filipino, one of my best friends, and said, someday you will be grateful that you're different. And she was so right, and I was able to take those differences and put them into a book that became my novel called Bridge of Scarlet Leaves. And essentially, in short, the story is about a violinist named Maddie Curran who secretly elopes with her Japanese-American boyfriend the night before Pearl Harbor is bombed. So, unfortunately, bad timing. And she follows him into the camp voluntarily, where she doesn't belong in either world. And her husband, wanting to prove his allegiance to America, which of course many of them did, joins the Military Intelligence Service, which is the MIS. They're a secret branch of the U.S. Army responsible for code breaking and interrogating against Japan. So they're probably more well known for being part of the Windtalkers. And they were actually assigned to any unit in the military, so they could be on the front lines in the Pacific with the Marines, where they risk being shot by either side. I couldn't imagine a better conflict than that, so I stuck that in the book as well. One of the best things I think that I really enjoy about writing historical fiction is the fact that I do get to deliver pieces of history to people who maybe wouldn't necessarily pick up a textbook or a nonfiction book, like myself. And so often I refer to my books as Advil, in that you get the sugar coating of the story on the outside, and hopefully you don't realize how much medicine and history you're getting on the inside until you're done, and you think, oh, I actually kind of learned a lot. So I care a lot about the details. The other thing that, that I'll mention before I close up is that I love being able to incorporate real personal stories, of course, around me. So anything you say to me after this, be careful of my book. I'm always like, that's a good one, I'm going to write that down. And so those are very, very fun, and I always love sprinkling my stories, or real stories of people I know into my books. Especially did that a lot with the World War II veterans from the Japanese Americans. But two of the more fun ones. One is that I was on an airplane with my mom coming back from Boston, and there were 4 or 5 soldiers who had just returned from Iraq. And the captain announced it over the speaker, and everybody applauded, and it was a really amazing moment. And one of them was seated right behind me. And the gentleman right next to him, who seemed very nice and very friendly and very talkative and loud, sat right next to him. And this poor soldier, he was just probably dead tired and just wants to get home to his family. And instead, the gentleman next to him used to be in the Army and wanted to regale stories and reminisce over his time in the Army. And he's behind me, talking very loudly, saying, I remember when I served with this guy in my unit in basic training, and this guy's last name was Sir, S-E-R, Sir. And the first day of basic, the sergeant comes in and says, I hope you don't expect me to call you Sir, Private. He said he got so many push-ups and sit-ups all through basic training because of that darn name. My mom leans over and says, I hope you're going to use that. And I said, you bet darn right I'm going to use it. You cannot make that stuff up. I regrettably I didn't get his name because I could have given at least him a free book. The other thing that's fun, and people ask me a lot of how much, especially letters from home, how much of it is really truly my grandparents' story, and there's very little of it in it as far as really them. It inspired the story, but there are definitely pieces of them sprinkled through many characters, which is very fun. excuse me, let's get dry. And one of them, my grandfather who inspired it, Papa, he was the funniest dark Irishman, that I think those go hand in hand actually, that I knew, and he always told jokes that you could never tell at parties today. And he was full of limericks, and you know, about my husband's from the Midwest, as well as my grandfather was from Iowa. My husband's theory is that everyone has relatives from Iowa that they don't want to admit to. And he was from there, and they would have limerick duels, and he would play euchre, and you know, I grew up always playing games with him. So we were very close, and we would play cribbage all the time, and I taught my 7-year-old, who's now addicted to cribbage, which is very fun. Cribbage and gin rummy, and we, you know, always checkers and whatnot. So these are the things that I got to incorporate, because those are my fondest memories of him. We always had time for the grandkids, always had time to play a game, and it's my best memories, really, of him. But the other thing that I remember most about him, besides his funny jokes, was that he had a tattoo that covered his whole forearm. And it was from his days of being a sailor. He was a Navy signalman on a destroyer escort in World War II. He was 17 when he enlisted after Pearl Harbor, and apparently he did what every good all-American young sailor did at the time, which was he got very, very drunk. And he went to a tattoo parlor, because that's where you should go when you're very drunk. And when he woke up in the morning, he had a bandage that covered his entire forearm. And I always think of the terror that must go through your mind as you're about to unpeel that tape and find out what you put on your arm. And it was a sailor girl, and thankfully she was clothed. And she was adorable, and I always remember her very fondly because she looked like the Cracker Jack girl. So she had her hands on her hips and the bell bottoms and the sailor cap, and when he wiggled his knuckles, he could make her shimmy and dance. Yeah, straight fiction, you can't make it up. And so I'm sure when he got it, I believe he called it his girlfriend for quite some time. And when I knew him, of course, he called it Grandma. So invariably, every time I called him on the phone, I'd say, "Hey, Papa, how are you doing?" And he'd say, "Oh, you know, good." I said, "Well, how's Grandma?" And he would always say, "Well, her boobs are drooping, but she can still dance." That gives you a little insight about him, which is why I just had to write that book. And of course, there's a character that has his nickname named Boomer, who is an Irishman with lots of bad jokes, and he makes his girlfriend jiggle and dance. So. Anyway, I think that kind of covers it. I'm sure it hit my time limit. Does anybody have any questions? I covered a lot, I know. So, I can tell you very quickly, actually, I'll start by saying what I'm working on next, because we're very excited about what you may have seen on Facebook that week, actually, because they've been going crazy. They're so excited. Because apparently I feel that sleep is overrated, I decided that I needed to take on another project several months back, and thought, you know, writing a novel is a lot of work. Writing a short story might be kind of fun. Okay. It's even harder sometimes. So I ended up recruiting 9 of my historical fiction, mostly women's fiction author friends, because there's a group of us, we run in small circles, and recruited a bunch of them. Some of you may know, like Kristen Hanna and Karen White and Jenna Blum, wrote those who say this, etc. Wonderful, all fabulous people. And so there ended up being 10 of us, and I said, how about we write an anthology together? We could pool our resources. We all have the same audience, wouldn't this be great? And we just have one big launch party, and that's all we really care about. So they all agreed, and it's called Grand Central. It all takes place at Grand Central Terminal in New York, right after World War II on the exact same day. So all of our stories are separate, and yet all of our stories sort of intersect with one more story. So it's a lot like the movie Love Actually, where our characters even pass each other, have one quick conversation, and yet they're all there for very different reasons, whether they're coming or going, and have a sometimes very tragic backstory. So that, Penguin actually bought that at auction, which is very exciting, especially to do as a group. We got to woohoo together. And that comes out July 1st, so we are planning one big 1940s fashion party, at Grand Central right now. So.